1965. At this point, the Civil Rights Act had passed, so the Voting Rights Act, and we had the 24th Amendment under our belts. So one would think that problem was solved at this point. We were on the right track. Nothing bad would happen from here on out. Well... So the Watts riots started on August 11th of 1965. This is only 6 days after the Voting Rights Act passed, and the two aren't really related, but it illustrates that just because all the major civil rights legislation had been passed at this point, the story was absolutely not over. The Watts riots resulted in 34 deaths, 1,032 injuries, and 4,000 arrests. It involved about 34,000 people and ended up in the destruction of 1,000 buildings, totaling in $40 million in damages. This all started when brothers Marquette and Ronald Fry were pulled over by a white CHP officer while driving their mother's car. Marquette failed a sobriety test and a panic-ensued scuffle began, which drew a crowd. Backup police were called in, and they arrived assuming the crowd was hostile, which it wasn't. The mother of the two brothers, Raina, showed up on the scene and, believing the police were abusing Marquette, rushed to pull the officers off of him, resulting in another fight. The crowd grew even angrier, and the officers also began to escalate the situation. Once the riots began, they grew exponentially and lasted for 6 days. The community tried to hold a meeting to stop the riots, but it was unsuccessful. The LAPD also refused to send in more black police officers to try to, balance the situation. The chaos covered a 50-square-mile area, and the police commissioner, William Parker, referred to the rioters as monkeys, a very clearly racist term. Muslims were also wrongly accused of agitating things. LAPD officers raided a mosque during this event, and fires broke out during this raid and burned the mosque down. Muslims and members of that mosque accused the LAPD of just doing this raid as an excuse to burn the mosque down, not for any actual reason. Okay, so why? Where did all this tension come from? Well, part of it was that living conditions in primarily black neighborhoods, like Watts, had been unacceptable for years. This was due in part to a lack of maintenance from the local government and a disproportionate amount of policing going on in the area, not to mention police brutality when, stops were made. Watts was not an isolated event. It was the culmination of years of oppression and an indication that there was still much work to be done in advancing civil rights. The march towards equality and justice seemed to be more of a crawl at this point, and in response to that, groups like the Black Panthers were formed to try to advocate in a admittedly radical way. So the Black Panthers were created in 1966 in Oakland, California, and they can best be described as a radical political social activism group. Their goals were sound, equal employment, equal pay, housing, and justice. Their methods were a little bit more gray. They were certainly aggressive and often had violent encounters with the police. Sometimes the police instigated these, and sometimes the Black Panthers instigated these. Violence was common within the group as well. But all that aside, they weren't, quote, one of the greatest threats to the nation's internal security, as FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover said. The Black Panthers organized free breakfast programs for school children and free health clinics in 13 different black communities. Were they a perfect organization? No. Did they always set the best example? No. But I wouldn't classify them as bad guys, and really neither does the government now. The new Black Panthers, on the other hand, are bad people. This is where some confusion might arise. Obviously, they have a very similar name, but please do not mix these groups up. They are not the same. The new Black Panthers were founded in Dallas, Texas in 1989, and as of now, they're classified as a racist hate group by the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights and the Southern Poverty Law Center. Those are the people who made that hate map that we've referenced a few times. The new Black Panthers encourages violence against Jews and white people, and the members of the original Black Panthers have said that this group in no way represents the values of the original group. The original group was radical, but they were not racist. Moving ahead chronologically, let's talk about the Detroit riots in 1967, and to do that, I'm going to hand it over to a new friend from the History Channel.
The Detroit riots. In 1967, a riot broke out during a long, hot summer night in the Virginia Park neighborhood of Detroit, Michigan. Lasting more than 2 days, it was one of the most destructive riots in American history. We're going to take a look at what set the riots off, the riots themselves, and the consequences. In the late 1960s, the civil rights movement in the United States was growing stronger, but racial inequality was still a big problem. Deindustrialization of the cities and the desegregation of schools was causing a reshuffling of neighborhoods. As part of integration efforts, people of color moved into urban areas that were once predominantly white. But in response, many white people fled to the suburbs, some scared of integration, and some having lost their factory jobs. This phenomenon is called white flight and contributed to segregation. With many whites having fled urban centers, business owners and politicians neglected these new, mostly black neighborhoods, leading to overcrowding and deterioration. While Detroit spent money on developing and racially integrating the inner city, black residents of neighborhoods like Virginia Park were still dealing with housing and employment discrimination, poor access to medical services, an underfunded public education system, and racism from law enforcement. On July 23, 1967, at 3:15 a.m., the Vice Squad of the Detroit Police Department conducted a raid on an unlicensed bar on 12th Street in Virginia Park. Although it was late, the street was full of people trying to keep cool because of a heat wave. While the police were making arrests, a brick flew through a police car window, prompting the riots, looting, and fires that would rage for days. On July 25th, Governor George Romney called in the Michigan National Guard, and the riots finally ended on July 27th. But the damage and human loss was unprecedented. 43 people died. Over 1,000 were injured. Over 7,200 were arrested. More than 2,000 buildings and structures were damaged, and hundreds of families were left homeless. The riots accelerated the exodus of white people from the city, making segregation even worse. But it also drew attention to the problem. President Lyndon B. Johnson appointed a commission to figure out why the riots happened. The report found that white racism, discrimination, and poverty were to blame for the riots. It warned, quote, "Our nation is moving toward two societies, one black and one white, separate and unequal."
Two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. That's a really good way to put it, and it's unfortunate, but I think that is the reality. And it's not something that you can easily just legislate away. I mean, you can make laws that make it harder for that sort of eventuality to exist, but at the root of it, you need to change the hearts and minds of people. You can't just tell them or ask them not to do this. That's why education is so important. Again, I might have a biased opinion towards education, but education really is important, guys. Next up chronologically is the 1968 Olympics Black Power Salute, and this is pretty punk rock. I mean, this is before punk rock happened, but you know what? It had the attitude. Tommy Smith and John Carlos, after winning the gold and silver medal respectively, decided that they would use this moment to send this powerful message. This occurred not long after Martin Luther King was assassinated, and anti-war protests were also gaining momentum back home. This was also just days after the Mexican government opened fire into a crowd of student protesters. By the way, this Olympics is being held in Mexico City. This was about the plight of marginalized people all over the world, said Tommy Smith in an interview. The white athlete's name in that picture is Peter Norman. He's from Australia, and he won the bronze. Yeah, the bronze. And, I'm sorry, you know what? He won the silver, and John Carlos won the bronze. So please excuse that typo. Anyways, Peter Norman stood with them in solidarity. He didn't raise his fist, but he still chose to stand up there with them because he supported their message. And it destroyed his career, unfortunately, and actually all of their careers were damaged by this. Though interestingly, Norman still received more backlash than Smith and Carlos. Anyways, though, I found this interview with Tommy Smith, and let's take a look at what he has to say about that day.
Do you think America ever forgave you?
No, I don't think so.
Because they recognized you in the end, didn't they? But
Well, the U.S. Olympic Committee has not awarded a stand for me or John Carlos in the USOC Track and Field Hall of Fame. And I held more world records than any man or woman in track and field history, and I'm not there. So there's a reason why that's happening. But that's the USOC. I do think there's good minds in America that deals with the reality of that necessity, Christian.
Pretty compelling stuff, right? I mean, while Smith's and Carlos's careers weren't necessarily destroyed from it, it's really unfortunate that they still don't get the recognition that they deserve. Okay, so let's fast forward about 24 years and talk about the Rodney King riots. So this is when Rodney King was beaten mercilessly for 15 minutes, right? So imagine starting to get beaten at the beginning of this video. And at this point in the video, right now, 11 minutes and 20 seconds as I'm looking at my screen, you'd still have about another 4 minutes to go of beating until it's over. That is a long time to get beaten with nightsticks. And yeah, Rodney King led the police on like a high-speed chase on the 210 freeway in San Fernando Valley. But getting beaten for 15 minutes is not the correct punishment for leading a high-speed chase. That we have a whole amendment against things like this, is cruel and unusual punishment. That is not what the police officers should have done. And they didn't even make an attempt to cuff him until he laid completely still. Rodney King kept trying to get up after each round of beatings, and instead of like just, cuffing him, they kept beating him even more. And we're going to get to some even more frustrating things infuriating things about this in just a second. Well, actually, right now, one of them, the officers were acquitted of this. They were charged again later on in 1993, but when this happened, the officers were acquitted, and the black community in LA was understandably furious about this, and riots broke out from there. The police response to the riots seemed to be purposely not to protect people of color during the beginning of the riots. Responses began to ramp up from there, but the first 3 hours or so of the riots, the police just kind of sat back and let it happen. Take a look at these pictures. When I say it looked like a war zone, it's not an exaggeration. This is probably some of the worst civil unrest that, for sure, LA had seen, and potentially the whole country. Almost 4,000 buildings were destroyed. 63 people died, which, considering all things considered, is actually not as much as I expected when I started making this video. And there's about $1 billion in damage. So we'll come back to this in just a second, but I want to help you guys understand why there was such a strong reaction to this event. So on top of what I already talked about Rodney King being mercilessly beaten for a quarter of an hour, and about how the cops responsible were acquitted, let's take a look at the conversations those police officers had with each other during and shortly after the beating of Rodney King. They said to each other, "Sounds almost as exciting as our last call," or, "Oh well, I'm sure the lizard didn't deserve it, haha," or, "It was right out of Gorillas in the Mist," or even, "I haven't beaten anyone this bad in a long time." This is just disgusting. To me, the worst one is that lizard quote. That "I'm sure the lizard didn't deserve it, haha." Like, how dehumanizing is it to refer to this person as a lizard, acknowledge that he didn't deserve this, and then laugh about it? And then these officers got acquitted. Look, I in no way condone the violence and the destruction in the reaction to the acquittal of these officers and the beating of Rodney King. But I can't say that I don't get it. How can you not be furious with this reaction? This is something that in 1992 just kept happening. It had been happening at this point for really centuries. And guys, it's still happening today. It just keeps happening. So each time people get angrier and angrier. Again, I'm not condoning the violence. I'm not condoning the death and destruction that comes out of this. But I understand the anger. And I'm already at 15 and a half minutes here, so I'll make this quick. But there is a whole other subplot to this riot going on in Koreatown in LA. So during the riots, the police didn't really offer much protection to the businesses in Koreatown for no real reason, racism. And as a result, a very significant portion of Koreatown was destroyed during these riots. But there was a select few of Koreans in Koreatown, Korean business owners, that had to just defend the businesses themselves because the law enforcement just refused to protect them. But the reason why I'm bringing this up is that on top of the savage beating of Rodney King, the negligence displayed by the LAPD during these riots, especially in the early hours of these riots, and the fact that the LAPD didn't provide the protection to business owners who were people of color really clearly illustrates the fundamental flaws within the LAPD. So before I wrap up this video, and as a surprise to nobody, I'm going to leave you with a musical connection from the 1992 Rodney King riots in LA. So the Rodney King riots happened in April and May of 1992, and Rage Against the Machine's Killing in the Name came out in November of 1992. And may I remind you that Rage Against the Machine is based out of LA, so they experienced the Rodney King riots. They are part of this story, and this song was recorded in direct response to the 1992 Rodney King riots and the beating of Rodney King. They chose to use this monk, you remember him from our Vietnam lesson? They used him as the cover for this album, and they did this very much on purpose. Th Quang Duc, that's his name, I remembered it. So he set himself on fire in front of the embassy in Saigon as a protest to the oppressive treatments of Buddhists in Vietnam under No Dinh Diem. So they're intentionally making these historical connections and saying, hey, we notice a lot of unfortunate similarities between the treatment of Black Americans throughout the history of America and what No Dinh Diem was doing to Buddhists in Vietnam. And we're going to make that very clear with our album. So I'll spare you the lyrical analysis of this song because A, we're at 18 minutes, and B, they're a little bit too explicit for for this video. So I suppose that's where we'll end this. We're going to come back to these themes again towards the end of this unit. We're going to have a couple of lessons on the true modern day connections, and there's a lot to talk about there. But I hope this video made you sort of rethink your internal timeline about civil rights. A lot of the times the story tends to get dropped after the mid-60s, and we sort of just forget about it. But we know that the story didn't end there. Some really terrible, sickening things happened after that, and really I hope this video did make you feel a little bit uncomfortable, because that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to put a spotlight on what we have done wrong in the past, because as the cliche goes, if you don't look at what you did wrong in the past, you don't know how to fix it moving forward. I know it does sound cliched, but it really is true. So hope this video sticks with you, and that's all I have for now. Bye.